ICE now allowed to continue patrols in Los Angeles as well. The Supreme Court making that decision. While ICE officials are also in Chicago, Allison, right now with the intent to round up undocumented immigrants with criminal records. All of this happening as President Trump is promising to expand the use of the National Guard in Chicago to combat crime. This increased military and ICE presence in cities is, well, it's unnerving for some people in our country. And at the same time, it's being cheered on by others who say something needs to be done about crime. Polls support President Trump's tactics. They break down by party lines. And earlier in the program, we heard from Republican political strategist Jeanette Hoffman. And now this morning, we are joined by liberal commentator Ahmed Baba. Let's continue this conversation. Ahmed, thanks so much for being here. How is this going for Democrats in saying we don't want the guard here? We're fine handling crime on our own.
Well, first off, thanks for having me, and it's cool to follow Jeanette. She's a friend, so I didn't get to catch her commentary, but we'll see. Hopefully, I balance it well. Well, I'd say Democrats here. What Trump's trying to do is put him in a bind, right? He is polling low on immigration. He's polling lower underwater on the economy. We see through the three slowest months of job growth since the pandemic that happened, and then we saw June revised down by 13,000, right? Negative. First job loss since December 2020. So what this is basically indicating is Donald Trump is trying to shift to a message of crime before the midterms, and he thinks he's putting Democrats on the defensive. So that's what the logic is here. And I think Democrats are kind of in a bind, right? Or he's trying to put them in a bind, where he's trying to say, look, I think crime is a problem, but at the same time, the National Guard is not the solution. So I think that's what Democrats are trying to walk.
And is that Ahmed? Is that working? I mean, are Democrats has he backed Democrats into a corner where they have to sound as though if they're fighting this, they don't care about crime?
Well, I think Democrats that have kind of a clarity on this are doing a good job. I think Wes Moore's speaking well to this, J.B. Pritzker, where you note the fact that these cities like Chicago, we saw steep declines in crime this year. The first half of the year, year to date, I think it was over a 30% decrease in violent crime. DC, 30-year low in violent crime heading into this year. We see Baltimore also seeing decline. So I think Democrats who are being smart about this are saying, hey, look, like we admit crime is a problem, and these horrific anecdotes that are being showcased are bad, and these criminals should be prosecuted. But threatening military action, coming into these communities, that is what I think is an overreach. And I think a lot of Democrats are framing it that way, where it's like you can acknowledge the fears people have, but at the same time, don't cede ground to what is obviously an authoritarian spectacle with some of the military deployments.
Ahmed, a lot of these cities that we're talking about, Baltimore, New Orleans, Chicago, where Trump is talking about putting the National Guard in the streets, do you think these cities are being targeted because they're largely governed by Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pattern is pretty clear. Most of these cities have three things in common: blue city, black mayor, blue state, right? And he's targeting explicitly these cities where 13 of the 20 states with the highest homicide rates are in Republican states. And Trump doesn't really name them. He mentioned New Orleans the other day very briefly, but didn't really pick up on that threat. So we're seeing a trend here where most of the states he's targeting fit that pattern of blue city, blue state, black mayor. And that, to me, indicates that this isn't really about crime. It's really about positioning ahead of the midterms. He wants to go on the offensive against Democrats here because he feels he's losing ground in these other areas. And we see, as you guys, really covered well the first block of this with the tariffs and the Epstein file release. These are other things he'd rather be talking about instead of those issues, the economy and these areas he's polling negatively on now.
You mentioned the statistics and the Democrats citing those stats as saying, crime is actually down in these cities where the president talks about things being out of control. That's the statistics. But what about how people are feeling? There are definitely people who feel they are not safe. They're afraid. So you have that sort of disconnect between what the stats show and how people actually feel about crime. If you're in the Oval Office, you're the Democrat in the Oval Office, what would you do instead to try to get a handle on violent crime in some of these cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance. I think just kind of trying to strike fear in these communities, militarizing the streets, and then essentially deploying ICE to do these patrols to inflict more fear. That's a short term band aid, right? Like you see decreases in DC crime because obviously, if there's military on the streets, there's going to be less people out in the middle of the night committing crimes. But if I'm a Democrat in office, I'm focused on real solutions, right? Like in DC, he was trying to talk about juvenile crime and black teens specifically, community engagement, programs that keep these young people engaged and grow. In Baltimore, they've invested in some of that. We see some localities that are doing this, where you're talking about actually doing preventative measures, where you're doing community engagement, community policing. I think also can build trust. I'm in Brooklyn, and when you go around, you see that the police fit the demographic profile of the specific neighborhoods. I think there's a lot of different ways you can build trust without just deploying federal troops, right? I mean, I think there's a middle ground that can be done here, and realistic reform, because you're right, the anecdotes and the crime we're seeing is real. It's not an imaginary thing.
I think there's something also really interesting happening, Ahmed, which is that public polling this week, I'm thinking of the CBS News poll, shows that Americans are against the National Guard in their cities. Okay. So it's 58% of respondents are against it, 42% back the decision. And it's almost as though something has changed in the White House. Well, let me ask you, why aren't they paying attention to public polling? Why does it feel as though that doesn't matter to them anymore?
Well, one thing the Trump administration does that I think Democrats should probably do more of is they don't focus as much on where people are at right now. They focus on where they're trying to move them. So where polling stands now, they're like, okay, we're going to go on an offensive, and in a lot of cases, I believe, a disinformation campaigns to try to sway public opinion in their direction. So I think what Trump's trying to do here is go out here with these big displays, highlight a lot of these anecdotes of crime to shift the public towards that direction. But as you're saying, and another specific part of that poll that I think is interesting is people have more support for National Guard going to like other cities as opposed to their own, because a lot of the time people will be watching, maybe Fox News or something, and seeing these cities, these faraway places with these horrible crime rates. But I'll walk outside Brooklyn and I'll see a grandma walking a dog, and I'm like, okay, maybe not my city. Maybe my city's okay, right? So I think we're seeing that kind of happening, and the Trump administration is going to try to wage a propaganda campaign to move these numbers.
All right, and I noted in listening to the Daily, the New York Times podcast yesterday, they were talking about how perception is very different depending on where you live in the district. In Washington, for instance, if you're in the center of the district near all the national monuments, you'll see the presence of the Guard. But if you're in some of these neighborhoods where crime is really a serious issue and residents are afraid, in Southwest, for instance, they don't note the presence of this inflow of National Guard. So I think it depends on a lot on actually how the Guard is being deployed in terms of what its impact truly is. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to note that daily episode was a really good episode. I think everyone should go listen to it to hear about the situation on the ground. And you have Southeast DC that sometimes doesn't have that much of a deployment, but we see there. I think Washington Post or New York Times did a graphic where you showed the map of where they're actually deployed. They're in these affluent areas. A lot of the time, they're standing around picking up trash in a lot of areas. Like it's really about where you deploy them. Like if this is really about crime, you'd want to deploy to these high crime areas almost exclusively. You wouldn't want to be sweeping these other areas. And what we see, it's kind of a double pronged strategy where they are then locking down some of these higher net worth areas, and then just like picking up Door Dashers that are on the way to drop food off to these areas and doubling as an immigration enforcement. So what I think is on the ground, it depends where you deploy them. But really, for me, I think most people don't want the National Guard coming down. They want local law enforcement to deal with it. They want the community and the policemen that they trust and that they know to be in their community, and not have, which is also illegal under the Posse Comitatus Act, to have the military doing direct civilian law enforcement. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach the Trump admin is trying to issue here. And I just hope cooler heads prevail. And, they're doing these ICE raids in Chicago, but I hope it does not become an effort to do a prolonged occupation, because it's not as legally justified as it would be under the Home Rule Act in DC, for example.
Yeah, obviously that's a big question, major question, whether he can do this legally in other cities outside of the district. Ahmed, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it. And this brings us to our question.